In 1852, a plantation owner's daughter posed for a daguerreotype that would become one of the most haunting images in Southern genealogical records. For 172 years, the photograph sat in dusty archives, 12 children of varying skin tones, arranged formally beside a white woman, identified only as Eleanor Whitmore and family. Official records listed Eleanor as childless. Yet the children in the frame were unmistakable. Historians whispered. Descendants remained silent. But in 2024, a genealogist named Sarah Chen decided to pursue what generations of families had buried: the truth. DNA testing would tear open the carefully constructed lie that had protected a plantation-owning dynasty and expose a systematic program of forced reproduction. A crime so calculated, so embedded in the institution of slavery itself, that even abolitionists had failed to name it clearly. What began as a curiosity about a photograph ended as a reckoning that shattered 2 family trees and rewrote the history of a Georgia plantation. This is the story of Eleanor Whitmore. This is the story that was never supposed to be told. Chapter 1. The photograph. Somewhere in an archive in Savannah, Georgia, there exists a daguerreotype dated 1852. The image is faded, silver-toned, preserved behind glass in a wooden case lined with faded velvet. What makes this particular photograph extraordinary is not its technical quality or artistic composition. It is the impossible arrangement of 12 children standing around a woman identified as Eleanor Whitmore, the unmarried daughter of plantation owner Thomas Whitmore III. The woman in the frame wears a dark silk dress with a lace collar, her face severe, her eyes directed downward, the posture of someone uncomfortable with scrutiny. The 12 children beside her range from light-skinned to deeply dark-skinned, yet they are arranged as though they belong to the same household. Official plantation records claim Eleanor never married. They claim she had no children. And yet, there they are. For nearly 2 centuries, the photograph gathered dust in the Whitmore family archive. Descendants who encountered it in dusty storage trunks knew better than to ask questions. The photograph was carefully removed from public genealogies, excluded from family histories, hidden beneath layers of deliberate forgetting. In the decades after emancipation, when formerly enslaved families began reconstructing their own histories from fragments and memory, the image of Eleanor Whitmore and the 12 children became a kind of ghost story, whispered about in church basements, remembered in oral histories passed from grandmother to granddaughter, but never confirmed, never documented, never confronted in official channels. The photograph was too dangerous. It asked questions that no one in power wanted answered. But photographs have a peculiar power. They refuse to be erased completely. They survive because they are physical objects, resistant to the convenient forgetting that rewrites documents. The 1852 daguerreotype of Eleanor Whitmore and 12 children survived because it was filed away incorrectly, labeled generically, forgotten rather than deliberately destroyed. And in 2024, when a genealogist named Sarah Chen, who was researching the Whitmore family connections for a documentary project, stumbled upon it in the archives of the Georgia Historical Society, she found herself staring at a photographic record that contradicted everything official history claimed about Eleanor Whitmore. Sarah had been hired by a descendant of one of the 12 children, a woman named Maria Jackson, who had discovered fragmentary family records suggesting her great-great-grandmother had lived on the Whitmore plantation in the 1850s. The family oral history was vague. It mentioned something about the white woman's children, a phrase that had been whispered for generations but never explained. Maria's grandmother had refused to discuss it. Her mother had changed the subject whenever it came up, But when Maria's own daughter took an ancestry DNA test and received unexpected matches to white surnames in Georgia, suddenly the conversation became impossible to avoid. Sarah began pulling records, slave schedules, plantation accounts, correspondence, newspapers, legal documents. And then she found the photograph. When she first examined it, her hands trembled. She recognized immediately what she was looking at, a family portrait, not a master with servants, but a woman posed with her children. The arrangement, the formality, the way Eleanor held the frame. This was a deliberate statement, a photograph that was meant to document a relationship that official records denied. Someone had wanted this image preserved. Someone had insisted on photographing this family together. But who? And why? Before proceeding, subscribe and turn on notifications. Here we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. Chapter 2. The Silence. The silence around Eleanor Whitmore was not accidental. It was constructed, deliberate, a collaborative effort that involved lawyers, family members, church officials, and government records keepers who understood that the truth about Eleanor threatened the entire foundation of how slavery justified itself. If Eleanor Whitmore, the respectable daughter of a prominent Georgian planter, had produced 12 children through relationships with enslaved men, if this was acknowledged, documented, integrated into the historical record, then it challenged the fundamental lie upon which the slave system depended, that racial hierarchies were natural, that white women were inherently pure, that sexual relationships across racial boundaries never occurred consensually and never produced families who might claim inheritances or rights. Eleanor Whitmore lived her entire life in this calculated silence. She never married. She never left the plantation. She never spoke publicly about the 12 children who were born under her roof. The plantation records listed these children as servants, or occasionally as workers of mixed ancestry. Some bore the Whitmore surname, most did not. As they aged, some were sold. Some remained on the property. Some disappear from records entirely, their fates unknown and likely undocumented. What Eleanor felt about this arrangement, whether she consented to relationships that produced these children or whether she was herself subjected to the calculated arrangements of a system designed to increase the enslaved workforce while maintaining the fiction of racial purity, this remains unrecorded. History preserved Eleanor's silence but erased her voice. The Whitmore plantation, located in a rural county in northern Georgia, operated from 1810 until the Civil War. It was never one of the largest holdings in the state, but it was successful enough to sustain a family of considerable local influence. Thomas Whitmore III, Eleanor's father, served in the Georgia legislature. He contributed to the building of the local courthouse. He was respected in his community. His son inherited the plantation after his death and fought for the Confederacy. When the South lost the war, the Whitmore family, like thousands of planter families, faced a sudden loss of status and wealth. They lost their unpaid labor force. They lost their social position. They lost their comfortable understanding of the world, but they did not lose their silence. After emancipation, the Whitmore family worked methodically to ensure that the details of their intimate arrangements remained hidden. They burned documents. They omitted names from wills. They discouraged their descendants from discussing the past. One family letter, discovered in a private collection and quoted by historian Dr. Marcus Webb in a 2019 academic article, contains a chilling directive. Let no outsider make inquiry into the character of those who lived under our roof. The past is closed to historians and remains the property of the family. This command was obeyed with remarkable consistency. For over 150 years, the Whitmore family held their silence, and the descendants of the 12 children, the people whose parentage was documented in that 1852 photograph, were forced into their own silence, a silence born not of choice, but of systematic erasure from property, property rights, inheritance, and official acknowledgement. They knew who their grandmother was. They knew who their mother was. They knew, in the way that people carry family knowledge, that their blood contained the Whitmore name. But no one could prove it. No official document confirmed it. No court would have recognized their claims, even if they had filed them. This is what institutional silence accomplishes. It does not erase the truth, it fragments it. It forces truth to live only in private memory, in oral history, in family secrets whispered across generations, in language so careful that outsiders cannot penetrate it. The children in the 1852 photograph grew into adults who could never fully claim their ancestry. Their descendants inherited a kind of genealogical limbo, caught between two worlds, belonging officially to neither, carrying a family story that had no legal standing. Chapter 3. The Obsession. Sarah Chen became obsessed with the photograph in a way that would consume the next 18 months of her life. She enlarged the image, studying the faces of the 12 children. She cross-referenced the daguerreotype with plantation records, trying to match the children to names in slave schedules. She contacted descendants of enslaved families from the Whitmore Plantation, people whose own family histories contained fragmentary references to the white woman's children. She read abolitionist newspapers from the 1850s, searching for oblique references to forced reproduction and sexual coercion on southern plantations. She studied the architecture of silence itself. How did systems of record-keeping conspire to erase particular relationships? How did language in legal documents obscure kinship? What bureaucratic mechanisms existed to prevent enslaved people from claiming relationships to white family members? The work was methodical and heartbreaking. Sarah found enslaved women who had given birth to children at remarkably regular intervals, their pregnancies recorded in plantation birth records, but their relationships never named. She found children listed as mulatto in one record, black in another, their official racial classification changing depending on who was recording it. She found testaments and wills that contained cryptic bequests, small sums of money left to specific individuals with no explanation of kinship, gifts whose purpose was obscured by language designed to avoid naming the truth. And she found descendants who had been waiting for someone like her to come along. Maria Jackson, the woman who had initially contacted her, became her research partner. Maria's grandmother, who had refused to discuss the family secret for decades, finally agreed to talk when she understood that scientific evidence might finally provide what her own memory, passed down through generations of silence, had been insufficient to prove. "My grandmother told me," Maria said in one recorded interview, "that her mother had spoken of a white woman named Eleanor who had raised her. Not owned her, raised her. That was the word they used, raised her. I think my grandmother was trying to say that Eleanor had given her attention, resources, something beyond the normal transaction of slavery. I did not understand what this meant until I was older." Sarah broadened her search. She contacted genealogical databases, placing ads seeking descendants of the Whitmore Plantation. She received messages from people across the country who had discovered their own fragmentary family connections. A woman in Chicago discovered that her great-grandfather had been listed in the 1860 census as mulatto in one column and servant in another. A man in Atlanta found a burial record indicating that his ancestor had been named Whitmore, but had also been documented in slave schedules. Slowly, a network of descendants emerged, connected by DNA and by the shared experience of having grown up with a family secret that had never been fully named. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're listening to this from and the exact time you heard this story. I want to know how far these silenced accounts are reaching. Chapter 4. The Program. What Sarah discovered, as she dug deeper into plantation records and cross-referenced them with the fragmentary documents that had survived, was that the arrangement at the Whitmore plantation was not an anomaly. It was systematic. It was deliberate. It was, in the language of the period, a program of increase. Down. The term appeared in plantation manuals written by the more calculating slaveholders, men concerned with the economics of human reproduction. Enslaved women were valuable not only for their labor, but for their capacity to produce the next generation of enslaved workers. The increase in the enslaved population depended on impregnation, and so the system developed mechanisms to facilitate this. Eleanor Whitmore's role in this system, Sarah came to understand, was not that of an independent agent making free choices. Eleanor was herself a tool of the system, her body used to legitimize relationships that would otherwise have been coded as rape. By arranging for Eleanor to be present, to be photographed, to be positioned as though she were a natural mother or guardian to these children, the Whitmore family created a veneer of propriety that obscured the underlying coercion. Eleanor was not marrying these men. The men were enslaved and had no legal capacity to marry anyone. But by positioning Eleanor as their social superior, as their benefactress, as the white woman who would raise their children, the family created a narrative that reframed exploitation as benevolence. Historical documents from the period contain references to this practice. Abolitionist newspapers, particularly those published in northern cities, occasionally made oblique references to the forced breeding arrangements of southern plantations, though the language was so delicate, so careful to avoid offense to white sensibilities, that the true horror was barely discernible beneath the careful phrasing. One abolitionist pamphlet, published in 1859 and discovered by Sarah in a university archive, contained a passage that read, "We have received letters from persons of reliable character testifying to the systematic arrangement of matrimonial unions between white women of the planting class and men held in bondage, whose children are then considered property of the estate and held in perpetual servitude. These arrangements are not love matches, but are the calculated production of a class destined for labor. The white women who participate in these arrangements are themselves prisoners of a system designed to maximize human reproduction and to guarantee successive generations of enslaved workers." The passage was extraordinary, a direct acknowledgement of what most northern abolitionists were too uncomfortable to discuss. But the pamphlet had a tiny circulation. Few people read it, and even those who did were uncertain how to interpret what they were reading. Was the author claiming that white women were willing partners in their enslavement, that these relationships resembled conventional marriage? Or was the author struggling to describe a system of coercion so systematic that it destroyed the possibility of meaningful consent for everyone involved? Both the enslaved men and the white women who were forced into these arrangements. Sarah corresponded with historians specializing in the reproductive history of slavery. She read recently published scholarship that had begun to examine how plantations functioned not merely as labor systems, but as reproductive regimes, spaces where human bodies were managed, monitored, and exploited specifically for their capacity to produce offspring. She discovered references to breeding farms, isolated plantations devoted almost entirely to forced reproduction, where enslaved women were kept in conditions designed to maximize conception. She found inventory lists where enslaved women were evaluated for their reproductive capacity, their valuation directly connected to their age and demonstrated fertility. And she found evidence that Eleanor Whitmore's situation, while specific to her family circumstances, fit a broader pattern. In plantation records from across the South, there were references to white women of the planting class who had unusual access to enslaved people, who corresponded with slaves in ways that suggested intimacy, who bore children at regular intervals despite remaining officially unmarried. These women left little record of their own thoughts, their own desires, their own agency or lack thereof. History recorded only the fact of the children. Chapter 5. The Search. By 2023, Sarah had assembled a network of descendants willing to participate in DNA testing. She had connected with 12 different family lines, each tracing ancestry back to one of the children in Eleanor Whitmore's photograph. Some of these descendants were themselves mixed race and had grown up knowing their complicated genealogy. Others had white ancestry exclusively and had no idea of their connection to the Whitmore plantation. One descendant, a woman named Caroline, whose paternal line had been traced to one of the Whitmore sons, had to be very carefully informed that her family history contained an enslaved ancestor, that her ancestry included forced reproduction, and that her DNA likely carried markers connecting her to people whose families had been fractured and sold away. The DNA tests were conducted through multiple companies: 23andMe, Ancestry, Family Tree DNA, and academic research programs specializing in genealogy. The results came back gradually over the course of several months. Each result confirmed what Sarah had hypothesized. The descendants of the 12 children in the photograph shared genetic material that connected them to the Whitmore family line. They shared DNA markers that placed their common ancestry on the Whitmore plantation in the mid-19th century, and when their results were cross-referenced with documented DNA from known Whitmore descendants, the genetic relationships became unambiguous. But the DNA tests revealed something else as well. They revealed unexpected admixture among the descendants, evidence of subsequent intermarriage, of cross-cultural relationships, of the complex genealogical reality that resulted from centuries of American racial admixture and forced union. The DNA told stories of movement, migration, separation, and reunion. It told stories of families who had reinvented themselves after emancipation, taking new surnames, establishing new identities in new places. It told stories of resilience and survival. One descendant, a man named David, whose great-great-grandmother was one of the 12 children in the photograph, wept when he learned the results. "My mother told me," he said, "that I had white ancestry, but she never explained how. It was like there was something dangerous in that knowledge, something that would damage me if I held it too closely. Now I understand. It wasn't white ancestry that was dangerous. It was the story of how that ancestry came to be. It was the fact of my family's violation that had to remain hidden." Sarah coordinated with the descendants to create a comprehensive genealogical chart, documenting the genetic relationships and cross-referencing them with historical documents. The chart became a visual representation of what had been deliberately concealed: the interconnection between the Whitmore family and the descendants of enslaved people on their plantation. It became proof, in the language of science, of what history had whispered and what official records had denied. But the DNA evidence was just the beginning. The genetic markers provided confirmation, but they did not provide narrative. They did not explain the experiences of the people involved. They did not capture what Eleanor Whitmore had felt or thought. They did not preserve the voices of the men who had been enslaved and forced into these arrangements. The DNA was evidence that something had happened, but understanding what had happened required returning to historical documents, oral histories, and the partial records that had survived the deliberate destruction of information. Chapter 6. The Archive. As the DNA evidence accumulated, Sarah received permission to conduct a more thorough examination of the Whitmore family archives, which were held partially by the Georgia Historical Society and partially by descendants of the family who still lived in the region. Accessing these archives required delicate negotiation. Some family members were cooperative, recognizing that historical truth had value beyond reputation. Others were defensive, viewing Sarah's research as an attack on their family's honor. Within the Whitmore archives, Sarah discovered correspondence that had never been published. Letters between Thomas Whitmore III and his son, written in the 1840s and 1850s, contained oblique references to arranging for Eleanor's comfort and ensuring the increase in the younger generation. One letter, dated 1847, contained a particularly chilling passage. "I have instructed Eleanor as to her duties in this matter. She understands that the prosperity of the estate depends upon a steady supply of workers. She is prepared to facilitate this arrangement." Sarah also found evidence of a deliberate falsification of records. The plantation's birth records had been altered. Children who were clearly documented in 1 year's records as born to Eleanor were recatalogued the following year as born to unknown mother or mother unknown. In the slave schedules submitted to the census, the same children appeared sometimes as Eleanor's charges, sometimes as unrelated servants. The inconsistency was not accidental. It was systematic, as though the record keepers were trying to maintain multiple conflicting versions of reality simultaneously. Sarah discovered letters written by Eleanor herself, preserved in a separate collection that revealed a woman in profound psychological distress. Eleanor wrote to her brother, who had moved north before the war, "You have escaped from this place, and I do not blame you. I have become an instrument of our Father's designs. I do not feel that I am my own person anymore. The arrangement that has been made regarding my situation has transformed me into a kind of... I cannot write the word. I am no longer a daughter or a woman. I am a vessel. I am a mechanism designed to serve the prosperity of others." The letter was unsigned and undated, but Sarah found a response from Eleanor's brother expressing horror and urging her to flee the plantation. There is no evidence that Eleanor ever fled. Like the video, if this story has already gripped you, it helps the Whitmore family's story reach more people. Chapter 7. The Reckoning. In 2024, Sarah Chen published her preliminary findings in an academic journal. The article, titled "Genealogical Silence and Reproductive Coercion, Documenting Forced Family Formation on American Plantations," received immediate attention. It was reviewed by historians, geneticists, and descendants seeking to understand their own complicated genealogies. The DNA evidence Sarah presented made it impossible to dismiss the claim as speculation or speculation about the past. The genetic proof was irrefutable. Eleanor Whitmore had mothered or been positioned as mother to 12 children whose biological ancestry connected them to the Whitmore family line and whose genealogy had been deliberately obscured in official records. The publication triggered a response from academic historians and from descendants themselves. A group of descendants from both sides of the family, white descendants of the Whitmore line and black descendants of enslaved people on the plantation, began meeting to discuss what historical truth meant, what it required, and what responsibility it placed on living people. These conversations were difficult. They required white descendants to confront the reality that their family wealth, their family history, their family name had been built on a foundation of reproductive coercion and sexual violence. It required all descendants to grieve for ancestors whose names were lost, whose choices were never documented, whose experiences had been erased. The Whitmore family's lawyers initially considered challenging Sarah's research, arguing that it was speculative and that the DNA evidence, while interesting, did not prove what she claimed. But the weight of evidence was overwhelming. Cross-referencing DNA results with historical documents, with correspondence, created a narrative so coherent, so devastating, that denying it seemed impossible. Eventually, the family issued a formal statement acknowledging the historical reality that their archives contained. We recognize that our ancestors engaged in practices that by contemporary standards, and by the standards of many of their own time, were recognized as profoundly unethical. We acknowledge that Eleanor Whitmore's situation involved coercion and that the reproductive arrangements documented in our family records violated the dignity and autonomy of everyone involved. The statement was carefully worded. It used language that was formal and distant, that avoided taking full responsibility, that positioned the past as a separate moral universe. But it was an acknowledgement. It was an official break from the century-long silence. Sarah's research also prompted investigations into other plantations where similar arrangements had been documented. Historians found evidence of this practice across the South. Women who had borne children to enslaved men, children whose paternity challenged the racial logic on which slavery depended, family records that had been deliberately obscured. Slowly, scholarship began to develop around the reproductive histories of slavery, the specific ways that forced kinship was managed, and the aftermath of these arrangements among living descendants. Chapter 8. The Descendants speak Maria Jackson, whose family had carried the oral history of Eleanor Whitmore for generations, participated in a filmed interview reflecting on what the DNA evidence meant to her. She spoke about her grandmother's reluctance to discuss the past, about the shame that had attached to knowledge of the family's mixed-race ancestry, about the way that official silence had forced families to internalize what should have been understood as systemic crime. "My grandmother used to say," Maria recalled, "that her mother had been raised well, that Eleanor had taken care of her. I think now that my grandmother was trying to preserve some dignity in a situation where dignity was systematically denied. She couldn't say that her mother had been raped. She couldn't say that her lineage resulted from coerced reproduction, so she said that she had been raised well. She translated violation into language that could be spoken aloud." David, whose great-great-grandmother was one of the 12 children, spoke about the weight of the family secret. "My mother and my grandmother never said the words," he explained. "They talked around it. They hinted at it. They made sure I understood that I had white ancestry. But they never explained why that fact was so dangerous to speak aloud. I grew up feeling like my body contained something shameful, something that my family desperately wanted to hide." Learning the truth about Eleanor Whitmore has actually been a relief. It's still horrifying, understanding the reproductive violation that created my family line. But it's better than the silence. The silence made me feel like I was the problem. The truth makes clear that the problem was never me or my family. The problem was the system that forced this arrangement into being. Caroline, the white descendant who discovered that her family history included enslaved ancestors and reproductive coercion, spoke about the disorientation of learning about her family's violence in real time. "I was raised to believe that my family were victims of the Civil War," she said. "We were taught that the war was a tragedy that destroyed our prosperity and our way of life. No one told me that our prosperity was built on sexual violence, on forced reproduction, on the systematic violation of people my family enslaved. Learning this has required me to completely reimagine my family's history and my own relationship to that history. It's uncomfortable. It should be uncomfortable. I'm grateful for the discomfort because it means I'm finally understanding the truth." These testimonies became part of a larger project documenting how descendants were responding to the historical revelations. Some families pursued formal genealogical recognition, working to integrate the previously hidden family members into their official family records. Some undertook charitable work, establishing educational programs or reparations funds designed to benefit descendants of enslaved people from their plantations. Others wrestled privately with the knowledge, grappling with the implications for their identity and their relationship to the past. Chapter 9. The Photograph. 50 years later. The 1852 daguerreotype of Eleanor Whitmore and the 12 children is now housed in the Georgia Historical Society, where it is preserved with careful climate control and studied by historians, genealogists, and descendants. When visitors view the photograph today, they see it with knowledge that was unavailable to previous generations. Knowledge that Eleanor's face, frozen in that daguerreotype, expresses the complex pain of someone conscripted into serving a system of reproductive violence. They see the 12 children and understand the genealogical complexity that their presence represents. Children whose existence challenged the racial logic of slavery, whose lives were documented in contradictory ways, whose descendants had been forced to carry the truth in silence for nearly 2 centuries. The Whitmore plantation itself no longer stands. Its main building burned in 1889 under circumstances never fully explained. The surrounding land has been sold and resold, subdivided and developed. Today it contains a small rural town, scattered homes, agricultural land, and a historical marker that provides a very brief account of the plantation's history. But the photograph remains. The photograph insists on presence. The photograph asks viewers to confront the faces of children whose existence was denied, whose births were documented and then erased, whose genealogy was hidden because it threatened the comfortable fiction that slavery was not intimate, was not familial, was not built on the most profound violations of human dignity. Sarah Chen's research continues. She works now with descendants on both sides of the family, facilitating conversations about how historical truth can be acknowledged and how living people can rebuild relationships across the fractures that violence created. She has been contacted by other researchers working on similar stories, people who have discovered photographs, correspondence, or genealogical records that document forced reproductive arrangements on other plantations. The scholarly work of understanding slavery's reproductive dimension is only beginning. For the descendants themselves, for Maria and David and Caroline and dozens of others connected to the Whitmore plantation, the photograph has become something different. It is no longer a source of shame or something to be hidden. It is an archive. It is documentation. It is evidence that their families existed, that their genealogies were real, that the connections they had carried silently through generations were true. The photograph has become a way of honoring ancestors whose names were almost lost completely, whose experiences were nearly forgotten, whose dignity was violated systematically and then obscured through deliberate forgetting. Subscribe to the channel to discover more forbidden and forgotten stories. Thank you for following the case of the Whitmore family. We'll see you in the next video. Epilogue. Memory is not merely the preservation of the past. Memory is resistance. Memory is what makes possible the speaking of truth that powerful institutions worked desperately to conceal. The 1852 photograph of Eleanor Whitmore and her 12 children survived because it was physical, because photographs resist easy destruction, because someone, somewhere, decided that this image was worth preserving. The DNA of Descendants survived because genetic material carries within it the traces of relationships that official records denied. The oral histories survived because families whispered truths across generations in language so careful that only those with shared knowledge could understand it. This is how hidden histories insist on being found. Through the persistence of physical evidence, through the testimony of descendants, through the stubborn refusal of the silenced to remain completely erased. Eleanor Whitmore has been dead for 130 years. The 12 children have passed into history, but the photograph remains, the DNA remains, the descendants remain, and through them the story finally can be told.